This man, whom some consider an emissary from history to revive the nation's glories, and some see him as a serial killer and murderer, while others classify him as a man who does not appreciate the consequences of things, and does not know where to put his steps, to finally meet a tragic fate not only for himself, but for his entire country. In our attempt to monitor the story of Saddam Hussein, we have collected dozens of sources in multiple languages: Arabic, English, French, German, and Hebrew, and we do not pretend that we will date the full life story of Saddam Hussein. This is something that needs a huge book. We will try to monitor the man's story from a new perspective, put him in front of us as a human being, monitor the psychological reactions inside him, and the regional and international interactions around him. It is the story of a man who ruled Iraq for about a quarter of a century, to end his life on the morning of Eid al-Adha for Muslims, hanging on a gallows made in America. In this attempt, we will only deal with the most important and prominent events in the life of Saddam Hussein: Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti, Saddam Hussein al-Majid, the dictator of Baghdad, the tyrant of the Arabs, or their hero. On the 28th of April in the year, the quiet village of Ajwa in the Iraqi province of Tikrit witnessed the birth of an orphan child whose father died before his mother gave birth to him, named Saddam Hussein. The people of Ajwa slept for the night safe and secure, not knowing that a child was born between their backs, in one of the poorest houses in the village, which is located in one of the poorest regions of Iraq, will turn the whole of Iraq into bustle and wars, ambitions and hopes, major setbacks and bitter defeats, and victories will pay dearly for them. Influenced by the ideas of Arab nationalism, Saddam Hussein affiliated with the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, as the ideas of the late Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, based on the revolution and socialist society, represented the intellectual basis that moved Saddam Hussein and shaped his composition and philosophy in many things. But the role of his uncle, Karal Atalfa, an officer in the Iraqi army, whom Saddam moved to live in his care since the age of 3, cannot be overlooked in the formation of Saddam's personality and instilled the ideas of nationalism, defiance, strength, and other qualities for which he was famous. Influenced by the ideas of Arab nationalism, Saddam Hussein affiliated with the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, as the ideas of the late Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, based on the revolution and socialist society, represented the intellectual basis that moved Saddam Hussein and shaped his composition and philosophy in many things. But the role of his uncle, Karal Atalfa, an officer in the Iraqi army, whom Saddam moved to live in his care since the age of 3, cannot be overlooked in the formation of Saddam's personality and instilled the ideas of nationalism, defiance, strength, and other qualities for which he was famous. Following his participation in an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the regime in Iraq, and the assassination of then Iraqi President Abdul Karim Qasim, Saddam Hussein left his country for Egypt, where he lived in the Daki neighborhood on the banks of the Nile for one of the most important periods of his life. It was there that Saddam Hussein received his university studies, where he enrolled as a student at the Faculty of Law, Cairo University, and also married Sajida, the daughter of his uncle, Karala. At the same time, Saddam Hussein also made friends with many inside Egypt, whether from his fellow students or even the patrons of cafes and restaurants and their owners, and stories abound about his bestowing gifts whenever he visited Egypt after assuming the presidency in Iraq, on everyone who stood by him during that period where he was living in difficult conditions. Before we go any further, let me just say that you are at the proper place if you enjoy documentaries and biographies. As for your subscription, it is up to how satisfied you are with our content. Your like for the video contributes to disseminating it to a larger number of people. I am grateful. Perhaps no one can say definitively about the limits of Saddam Hussein's nuclear ambition. Did he just want electric power? That seems a very low probability given the nature and character of the man. In any case, what may be more likely to say is that Saddam had a plan to have the necessary capabilities to produce a nuclear bomb at any time he decides to do so, a situation in which the state does not actually own nuclear weapons, but it has enough nuclear reactors to manufacture them if it decides to do so, and it remains a matter of time. Besides the personal nature of Saddam, the Israeli handling of his nuclear ambitions reveals that the Israelis had some information, which makes them believe that Saddam had chosen to have at least a manufacturing capability. Israel strongly pressured France, which made the reactors, Tammuz Wahid, and Tammuz Ithnain, for Iraq, in order to reduce the technical capabilities that Paris agreed with Iraqi scientists and their Egyptian president, Yahya Masht. Yahya al-Mashhad himself would be assassinated in a Paris hotel room by Israeli Mossad agents shortly thereafter after they failed to mislead him in practice or recruit him in intelligence terms. And in June, Israeli warplanes launched an airstrike in which they destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, thus putting an end to Saddam Hussein's nuclear ambition, in an operation called Opera or Babylon. Most of the analyses, books and articles about the First Gulf War have always been led to say that it was a war that flared up as a result of the paranoia and dictatorship with which Saddam acted to ignite the war with Iran. Strangely, we found a report published by one of the most important Israeli newspapers, Yedioth Ahronoth, in September, in which she said that the reality that surrounded Saddam Hussein when he made the decision to war was more complicated than many people think, and even stranger, she considered that Israel had something to learn from Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, which has an area of often twice the size of Iraq, with a population twice the number of Iraqis, and at that time it had an armed and trained army to the highest Western standards, inherited by the Islamic Revolution from the Shah, an ally of America. But if we tried to jump into Saddam Hussein's mind back then, we would find Saddam was trying to seize the opportunity, assuming that the Islamic Revolution was followed by large arrests within the army of Shah loyalists, which greatly weakened Iran, as the army was emptied of many qualified commanders, highly trained pilots, and officers of various ranks. So Saddam tried to end the negative effects of the Algiers Agreement, which many considered a surrender treaty, which he himself signed when he was still in the post of vice president, with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi before the revolution against him, for the purpose of sharing the Shat al-Arab between Iraq and Iran under the auspices of the late Algerian president Houari Boumediene. This is the most famous novel about the reasons that prompted Saddam Hussein to start a war with Iran. Before we go any further, let me just say that you are at the proper place if you enjoy documentaries and biographies. As for your subscription, it is up to how satisfied you are with our content. Your like for the video contributes to disseminating it to a larger number of people. I am grateful. But it ignores multiple facts. First, Saddam welcomed Khomeini's coming to power. He expressed the hope that the two countries will live in peace. Secondly, Khomeini initiated a series of clashes with Iraq, from which Saddam understood that Khomeini was seeking a confrontation with Iraq in order to strengthen his position inside Iran in the face of moderate, secular, and pro-Western elements. Third, Iranian support for an armed secret group operating in the Shiite south, where some of the major oil fields are there, and Iraq's important ports. Fourth, the attempt to assassinate Tariq Aziz, a prominent leader in the regime. The bitter war will continue for 8 years, until it comes to an end, and each side sees itself the victor in it, although the Iraqi army has sealed it with a series of consecutive victories, but the human bill, which has reached more than 1 million dead, denies any justification for the continuation of this war, except the personal stubbornness between two men, Saddam and Khomeini. In August, Saddam Hussein reignited the war. This time he chose Kuwait as his target, and it was the opposite in everything from Iran. His army is bigger, stronger, and incomparably more armed than his Kuwaiti counterpart. Kuwait itself is a very small country geographically, but it is full of oil. His 8 years of war with Iran had left Saddam with a huge army out of work, and left enormous economic scars in Iraq. Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of manipulating oil prices at times, and at other times of stealing it from Iraqi fields, and in the meantime he asked the Kuwaitis to drop the debts owed to them by Iraq. The pre-invasion period was fraught with fear of military aggression against Kuwait, while many underestimated this possibility, and spoke confidently that it was impossible for Saddam to attack Kuwait, and that he was only maneuvering to achieve as much economic gains as possible. But before midnight August, the Iraqi army's offensive began, and when a new day dawned, it had completed the occupation of the whole of Kuwait. Unfortunately, the entire region, not just Iraq, has paid the price for this war. The Arabs lost Iraq, their powerful eastern flank and gate, and lost its glorious Talid army, which once came to protect Damascus when things turned against the Syrians in the October War, and the Israelis responded in their wake. King Fahd, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Tunisian Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, and a number of other Arab leaders tried to convince Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Iraq, while the Iraqi president tried to maneuver and buy time and pass it in the hope of establishing a fait accompli, events will prove to Saddam himself that his bets were all wrong at that time. An international coalition of dozens of countries led by the United States of America expelled the Iraqi army from Kuwait after occupying it for 7 months, and the era of blockade, sanctions, and oil for food began. During that era, Iraq lived its worst period under the rule of Saddam Hussein. Some estimates indicate that the famine killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and Kurdistan witnessed heavy fighting. The attack on Israel. During the international mobilization in preparation for the attack on Iraqi troops in Kuwait, Saddam Hussein tried to turn the tables on everyone. Saddam decided to launch rocket attacks on Israel, trying to scratch the nose of the Israelis to rush retaliatory strikes against Iraq, and then Israel will appear as part of the coalition, which represents political pressure on all Arab countries in the international coalition in front of their people, which may dismantle the coalition itself from its origins. If you search for Saddam Hussein's name today in the Israeli media, you will find that he is classified, for example, in the category of enemies, at Makan TV, the official Israeli channel aimed at Arabic speakers. He is the man who wanted to rule the world and destroy Israel, Makan adds about Saddam. The American invasion of Iraq. In the wake of the attacks, America publicly declared the war on terror, took out all its weapons and went to fight. Under the table, the interests of the big oil companies were moving. At that time, it was said that the most powerful US and British intelligence services had evidence that Iraq, besieged for years, was developing weapons of mass destruction. Also at that time, Saddam Hussein agreed to all the requests. He knew that he could not start a war this time, but the war on Iraq was now being cooked. International inspectors searched everywhere and found nothing. Nevertheless, Saddam agreed to destroy Iraq's stock of Scud, surface-to-surface, ballistic missiles, but all these concessions did not stop the conspiracy. The fact is that Saddam Hussein's regime at that time, almost no one cried for him except, of course, Muammar Gaddafi's speeches, and military operations began from the territories of his long-fought neighbors. The Iraqis initially showed courage and steadfastness in a number of areas, but everything quickly collapsed. Between the betrayal and the lack of Iraqi readiness, everything quickly collapsed. Militarily, the Iraqis focused on the defense of cities, placing large troops in each city, providing their cities with large reserves of supplies and funds, hoping to fight a long-term urban war, but the American troops ignored these defenses and rushed into the desert and from the voids between Iraqi cities. Although this plan, defending the cities, was a good idea and could defend itself, the sometimes unjustified collapse of morale, and often betrayal, made the Iraqi cities not defend themselves well. Saddam Hussein also made a serious mistake in this war by assigning military command to an unqualified and even non-student of military science, his son, Qusay, who committed a serious military mistake by installing large forces to defend some cities and leaving other areas fighting individually without support. Militarily, this would not have definitely changed the final outcome of the war, but at least it would have prolonged its duration, cast doubt on the Americans, and even given the opportunity to stop the whole battle. Besides, Saddam Hussein's reliance on the commanders of military divisions was based on trust, not competence, and according to the testimony of Lieutenant General Rod Majid al-Hamdani, who was the commander of the 2nd Iraqi Republican Guard Corps, in his book, Before History Left Us, that the leaders of the army and the Republican Guard were racing to a show of force to reassure former President Saddam Hussein. As the years go by, the whole world will discover the lie of the narrative by which the government of the largest country in the world, USA, and the old empire, UK, justified the invasion of Iraq, and it will become clear that there was no Iraqi nuclear program. Moreover, views, such as those expressed by Senator Rand Paul, were brought up in America itself that the hawks from the Republican Party created ISIS because of the chaos that followed their intervention in the Middle East and the invasion of Iraq. The arrest of Saddam Hussein. It was cold that night, but the U.S. Marines who had orders to arrest Saddam Hussein were feeling very hot. They were steps away from the #1 enemy of their country. 9 months of searching and chasing since the fall of Baghdad on the day when Saddam Hussein evaporated, after the entire Iraqi army evaporated. Apparently the Americans expected that Saddam would be surrounded by many guards and men. Perhaps this explains why, according to their official statement, they mobilized for this operation, which they called Operation Red Dawn, hundreds of soldiers of the 1st Division, the Cavalry Division, and Special Forces elements. But what happened was that the capture of Saddam Hussein was so easy that not a single shot was fired throughout the operation. American soldiers found Saddam inside a hole in a farm on the banks of the Tigris River. Surprisingly, they had failed to find anything at first, and Saddam almost escaped from their hands. The American version was questioned by many Iraqi sources who confirmed that Saddam Hussein was arrested from inside a fortified shelter and not from a hole, and that what was shown was an American show, just a show of force. Trial of the Century. The trial of Saddam Hussein was called the Trial of the Century, and no one believes that there is a trial anywhere in the world that has received as much attention and follow-up as happened in the trial of Saddam Hussein. Throughout the sessions of his trial, Saddam Hussein managed to attract to himself more of what can be described as sympathy, the average Arab street man. From the very beginning, there was a state of anger prevailing in the region at the idea of invading an Arab country and arresting and prosecuting its president. During his trial, Saddam Hussein showed a mixture of pride and self-pride, and his conversations with the judges were characterized by strength and steadfastness. We see him reminding one that the decision to appoint him as a judge came from him personally, and reminding the other that he had pardoned him and prevented the execution of a sentence against him years ago. In general, Saddam considered his trial illegitimate, that he was the legitimate president of Iraq, and without the American invasion of Iraq, no one would have been able to try him.